In the world of power, money, and family, loyalty is often the first casualty when greed and betrayal take hold. For years, the Williams brothers, Richard and Thomas, had been the epitome of success. From humble beginnings, they had built a thriving business empire together, a legacy that would last for generations. But what appeared to be the perfect partnership, rooted in family and mutual respect, would ultimately unravel in a shocking act of betrayal. Richard Williams, a man who had earned the respect of everyone he met, and Thomas, his younger brother, had always been inseparable. Or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, tension had been brewing for years. A simmering resentment, fueled by jealousy and unspoken desires, would soon explode into a crime so brutal that it would destroy everything the brothers had worked for. This is the story of a man who betrayed the one person he should have loved and trusted the most, all for the promise of a fortune. A story of obsession, manipulation, and the deadly price of ambition. This is the tragic tale of a family torn apart by greed. This is the fatal betrayal of the Williams brothers. Richard and Thomas Williams had always been the perfect team. Growing up in a small, unremarkable neighborhood, they worked together to help their parents keep the family afloat. Their father, a mechanic, and their mother, a schoolteacher, were hardworking but struggled to make ends meet. The Williams boys learned early on that success didn't come easy. It had to be earned. Through grit and determination, Richard and Thomas founded their own company, Williams Industries. From manufacturing high-end automotive parts to securing government contracts, they quickly rose to prominence. By their 30s, they were millionaires, running a company that was the envy of the industry. Their business became their pride, and their partnership a well-oiled machine. Richard was the visionary. He was intelligent, ambitious, and had an uncanny ability to make things happen. Thomas, on the other hand, was the charmer. People loved him. He was easy to talk to, personable, and had a knack for smooth-talking clients into signing lucrative deals. Together, they complemented each other perfectly. But while their public image remained flawless, privately, cracks were beginning to show. Thomas had always looked up to Richard, but as their success grew, so did Thomas's ambitions. Richard's ability to make the tough calls and run the company with precision became a source of resentment for his younger brother. Thomas wanted more than just the perks of being Richard's partner. He wanted control, he wanted power, and he was willing to do anything to get it. It wasn't long before Richard began noticing the subtle signs of his brother's dissatisfaction. Thomas, once content with their shared success, started to question Richard's decisions. He felt overlooked and underappreciated. Every promotion, every decision that Richard made seemed to reinforce the growing divide between the two brothers. But the tipping point came when their father fell ill. The Williams family had always been close-knit, and their father's declining health hit Richard and Thomas hard. While Richard was focused on taking care of their father, Thomas saw an opportunity to finally take control. He started to quietly court investors and key figures within their company, positioning himself as the true leader of Williams Industries. One day, Richard came to the office early to find Thomas in a meeting with their largest investor, talking about expanding the company into international markets. Richard had always been the one to make the big calls, and seeing his brother making plans behind his back was the final straw. Tensions boiled over, but Richard, ever the professional, swallowed his anger. He had always believed that family came first, but he was starting to realize that for Thomas, it was power that mattered more than anything. As Richard confronted his brother in the quiet of his office, Thomas's words hit like a cold slap. "You've had your turn, Richard. It's time for me to take the reins. You've had control for too long. I've been patient, but I won't wait anymore. I'm going to make sure this company is mine." Thomas's words stung, but Richard wasn't ready to give up. He reminded his brother of their family legacy, the years they had spent building Williams Industries together. He implored him to remember the values their parents had instilled in them: honor, loyalty, and trust. But it was too late. The seed of betrayal had already been planted in Thomas's mind. Richard had underestimated just how far his brother was willing to go to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Slowly but surely, Thomas began to work in the shadows. He started secretly funneling money out of the company, making deals without Richard's knowledge, and manipulating employees to align with his vision. But Richard, ever vigilant, noticed the discrepancies. He began to piece together the puzzle, finding evidence of his brother's betrayal. But Richard's biggest mistake was not acting sooner. He hesitated. He tried to reason with Thomas, convinced that his brother could be talked down. However, Thomas had already made up his mind. As the days passed, Richard's grip on the company and his brother slipped further away. Then, one fateful evening, Richard received a call that would change everything. It was from an anonymous source, someone who had been close to Thomas. The tip-off was simple but damning. "Your brother is planning to sell the company out from under you. He's made a deal with our biggest competitor. He's taking the company for himself." That was the moment Richard realized that he was no longer dealing with the brother he had once loved and trusted. The betrayal was real, and it was coming for him. The pieces of the puzzle came together, and Richard knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let Thomas destroy everything they had built together. As the news of the betrayal spread throughout the company, Richard's first instinct was to confront his brother. But as the confrontation loomed, he realized that Thomas wouldn't back down. The hunger for power had consumed him entirely. Richard was no longer sure what to do. He felt cornered, desperate. He had worked his entire life to create this empire, and now it was slipping away, piece by piece. In his desperation, he began to consider extreme measures. What if he could get rid of Thomas for good? What if he could remove the threat to his empire and reclaim his life? The idea haunted him, but as the days wore on and the tension between the brothers escalated, Richard made his choice. He would stop Thomas permanently. It happened late one evening in the warehouse, a place that had been the heart of their business for years. Richard called Thomas there, under the guise of a final meeting to settle their differences. Thomas, confident that he had won, arrived alone, unaware of the deadly trap his brother had set for him. Richard had prepared everything carefully. He had planted evidence of financial misconduct and embezzlement, enough to destroy Thomas's reputation. But what he hadn't planned for was his own fury. The conversation quickly turned hostile. Words were exchanged, harsh accusations hurled at each other, and the animosity that had been brewing for years finally boiled over. Richard, overwhelmed by years of betrayal, snapped. In a moment of blind rage, Richard grabbed a knife from a nearby table, a tool that had been used countless times in their business. Without thinking, he plunged it into his brother's chest. Thomas gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. You really did it," he whispered, blood spilling from the wound. For money, for power. Richard stood over him, frozen. He had just killed his brother. The man who had once been his closest confidant was now lying lifeless at his feet, the culmination of years of betrayal, obsession, and greed. As the blood pooled around Thomas's body, Richard realized the magnitude of what he had just done. The company, the empire, the fortune, it all meant nothing now. He had sacrificed his brother and, in doing so, had destroyed everything he had worked for. But as the police closed in and the body was discovered, Richard's facade began to crack. What had once been a carefully planned crime was now spiraling into a nightmare of lies, deceit, and bloodshed. Richard knew his actions would soon come to light, but what he didn't realize was that his brother's death would set off a chain of events that would expose even darker secrets buried deep within the Williams family legacy. As Richard sat in his office, awaiting his arrest, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if Thomas had known something he didn't? What if his brother's death was just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy? It didn't take long for the police to arrive at the scene. The warehouse where Richard had killed his brother was the same place they had both worked tirelessly for years, building an empire, dreaming of a future. But now, that dream was stained with blood. When the authorities arrived, Richard was still standing over Thomas's body, his hands trembling, his mind racing. The knife that had ended his brother's life was still gripped tightly in his hand. It was a moment of raw fury, a crime of passion fueled by years of resentment. But as Richard was taken into custody, the police knew there was more to this story than just a simple murder. Detective Carla Mitchell, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most complex cases, was called to lead the investigation. She arrived at the crime scene with her team, immediately noticing the tension in the air. Richard's cold demeanor only added to the suspicion surrounding the case. He didn't seem shocked or remorseful. If anything, he seemed detached from the gravity of the situation. As she examined the scene, Detective Mitchell noticed something unsettling. Richard's office had been meticulously cleaned, as though someone had been trying to cover their tracks. The evidence of financial discrepancies and embezzlement, which had been building over time, was scattered throughout the office, carefully hidden behind locked files and encrypted documents. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. In the hours following his arrest, Richard was left alone in a small interrogation room. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights above did little to comfort him. He sat in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound boulder. His thoughts drifted back to the events of the night. His brother, lying lifeless on the cold concrete floor, his final words echoing in Richard's mind. "You really did it. For money, for power." Richard had always prided himself on being a man of control. He had built an empire from the ground up, risen above his circumstances, and proven that he was capable of anything. But now, standing in a cold, empty room, he realized just how far he had fallen. In the quiet moments, Richard began to understand something that he had never truly considered before. The man he had become was not the person he had aspired to be. He had spent so many years seeking power, seeking validation from the business world, that he had lost sight of the people who mattered most: his family, his brother. He had killed the one person who could have helped him achieve even greater success, and now he was paying the price for it. But even as the reality of his actions settled in, Richard couldn't help but wonder, what if Thomas had known something he shouldn't have? As the police investigation continued, new revelations began to emerge. It wasn't long before Detective Mitchell uncovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the Williams brothers. Hidden within the mountains of paperwork, encrypted files, and obscure business deals, there was one piece of evidence that stood out. Thomas had been running his own operation behind Richard's back. While Richard had been focused on expanding the company, securing contracts, and building his empire, Thomas had been secretly planning to take over the business for himself. He had been siphoning funds from their joint accounts, making shady deals with competitors, and even attempting to secure patents and intellectual property without Richard's knowledge. What was even more shocking was that Thomas had planned to buy Richard out of the company, using the money he had quietly accumulated over time. He had carefully manipulated the financial situation to position himself as the sole owner of Williams Industries. The murder wasn't just about power, it was about survival. Thomas had seen Richard as a threat, and in his mind, killing his brother was the only way to guarantee his own future. But the betrayal didn't stop there. Detective Mitchell uncovered another, more disturbing detail. Thomas had been involved in illegal activities that reached far beyond the realm of business. He had been linked to organized crime syndicates, using the company's resources to fund illicit operations. His ties to these criminal organizations were deeper than anyone had imagined, and they went all the way back to his early days at Williams Industries. Richard had no idea that his brother's life had been a double-edged sword, filled with lies and corruption. The betrayal was not just personal. It was a systematic attempt to destroy Richard, to take everything he had worked for and claim it for himself. As the truth about Thomas's secret life began to surface, Richard realized the full extent of his brother's manipulation. Thomas hadn't just been trying to steal the company. He had been plotting to destroy Richard's reputation and take everything he had worked for. The foundation of their entire empire was built on lies, deceit, and treachery. But even in the face of these revelations, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He began to question whether Thomas's actions had been part of a larger conspiracy, something bigger than just sibling rivalry. Had Thomas been working with someone else? Had there been others involved in this elaborate plan to ruin him? Richard's mind raced as he tried to piece together the remaining fragments of the puzzle. He had always been a man in control, a man who built his empire with his own hands. But now, in the wake of his brother's betrayal, Richard was beginning to see that his entire life had been a facade. The empire he had built, the legacy he had created, was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest gust of wind. As the investigation into Thomas's death continued, Richard's fate seemed inevitable. He had already been charged with first-degree murder, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The police had uncovered the secret documents, the hidden accounts, and the disturbing details of his brother's criminal activities. But the most damning evidence came from Richard's own words, his admission of guilt, his cold demeanor, and his inability to express any true remorse for what he had done. Richard's empire was crumbling, and he knew it. The thought of losing everything he had worked for, his fortune, his business, and his reputation, was almost too much to bear. But in the quiet of his cell, as the walls closed in around him, Richard realized that his greatest loss was not the company or the money. It was the loss of his brother. The person he had once trusted more than anyone else, the person he had once loved, was gone forever. But the story didn't end there. As Richard sat in his cell, awaiting his trial, a chilling discovery was made. Another file, hidden deep within the company's records. This one was different. It contained information about a mysterious figure, a person whose name had never come up before. Who was this individual, and what role did they play in the downfall of the Williams brothers? After Richard's arrest, as the investigation progressed, the police discovered a file that hadn't been accounted for in the initial rounds of evidence. It was a document buried deep within the company's encrypted records, one that Thomas had hidden just before his death. When Detective Mitchell uncovered it, the contents of the file sent a chill down her spine. The file detailed a mysterious individual by the name of Elena Vargas. There were no photos, no direct links to the brothers, but the information within the file indicated that Elena had been working closely with Thomas in the months leading up to his death. She had been involved in illegal dealings that even Richard was unaware of, and it seemed that Thomas's business transactions weren't limited to just the company. What was even more troubling was the mention of offshore accounts, where large sums of money had been funneled over the years. These accounts were under Elena's name, but they were linked to the Williams brothers in ways Richard could never have imagined. It seemed as though Thomas had been grooming Elena to be his accomplice in taking over the company. For the first time, Richard began to realize the full extent of his brother's betrayal. But it didn't stop there. The deeper Detective Mitchell dug into Elena Vargas, the more disturbing the picture became. Elena wasn't just some business associate. She was connected to a powerful underground network of money launderers, corrupt officials, and criminal syndicates. This network had been pulling the strings behind Thomas's actions, and Richard had unknowingly been dragged into it. As Richard sat in his holding cell, awaiting trial, the walls began to close in around him. He had always considered himself a man of power, someone who could control his destiny. But now, he saw that he was just a pawn in a much larger game. Elena Vargas, the woman who had never once been on his radar, was the true mastermind behind everything that had unfolded. Richard had no choice but to confront the reality that his brother's death might have been a part of Elena's plan all along. She had orchestrated the downfall of the Williams brothers, manipulating Thomas to destabilize Richard and, ultimately, gain control of the company. But what Richard couldn't understand was why Thomas had been so blind to Elena's true intentions. Had he really been in the dark? Or had Thomas, too, been part of Elena's plan from the beginning? The questions swirled in Richard's mind, leaving him restless and consumed with guilt. He couldn't deny the fact that he had killed his brother in cold blood, but now, he wondered if he had been pushed to this point by forces much larger than his own ambitions. Was he truly the villain in this story? Or had he been a victim of betrayal, just as Thomas had been? Detective Mitchell's investigation revealed yet another shocking layer to Elena Vargas's role in the brothers' downfall. Elena had planned for Richard's eventual fall from grace. She had been quietly positioning herself to take over the company after Thomas's death, even going so far as to establish fake identities, forge documents, and manipulate key investors to ensure she had control when Richard was gone. In the file, Elena's notes were clear. Once Richard is out of the picture, I'll own Williams Industries. Thomas was just a stepping stone. It became evident that Elena had manipulated Thomas's envy and greed, driving a wedge between the brothers and pushing Richard into a corner. Thomas had been the perfect pawn, willing to betray his brother in the hope of a better future. But Richard's actions, his murder of Thomas, had only played into Elena's hands. She had carefully orchestrated everything from the shadows, knowing that if Richard killed Thomas, he would only doom himself to a lifetime of regret and disgrace. Richard's anger grew as he read the file. He had killed his own brother, and for what? To hand everything over to Elena Vargas, a woman he didn't even know? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been played by everyone: his own brother, the woman he had never met, and even the company he had dedicated his life to. As the trial approached, the pressure on Richard mounted. The evidence against him was irrefutable. He had murdered his brother in cold blood, and there was no escaping that truth. But as Detective Mitchell continued to investigate the full extent of Thomas's betrayal and Elena's manipulation, she began to connect the dots between Richard, Thomas, and Elena in a way that was even more damning. Richard had unknowingly been part of a much larger criminal scheme. The money laundering, the offshore accounts, the corruption, everything was tied together, and Richard was at the center of it. The once respected CEO of Williams Industries was now just another criminal, caught in a web of lies and deception. His legacy had been completely destroyed, and he was about to pay the ultimate price for his greed and obsession. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting its case. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury didn't take long to deliberate. The trial lasted only a few weeks, but by the end, Richard's fate had already been sealed. The courtroom was filled with tension as the verdict was read. Guilty of first-degree murder, the judge said. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Richard's face went pale as he realized that his world had just come to a devastating end. But as Richard was led away in handcuffs, his thoughts drifted back to the file. Elena Vargas was still out there, her plan to take over the company moving forward without him. And Richard, the man who had once controlled everything, was now powerless to stop her. In the final hours before Richard was sentenced, Detective Mitchell uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. Elena Vargas had not just been manipulating Thomas and Richard for money. She had bigger plans, ones that involved destroying everything the Williams brothers had built. Elena wasn't interested in the company or the wealth it provided. She was after something far more valuable, something that would make her untouchable. It was revealed that Elena had been working with powerful criminal syndicates that had ties to international arms deals and underground markets. The company's success, once a symbol of the American dream, was now a cover for laundering money for these dangerous organizations. Thomas and Richard had been unwitting pawns in a much larger game, and their deaths would pave the way for Elena to rise to power in the world of global corruption. As the truth about Elena's motivations came to light, Richard, now a convicted murderer, realized too late that his downfall wasn't just about his greed. It was about the devastating power of obsession and betrayal, and how his ambition had led him straight into Elena's hands. But Elena's victory might not be as secure as she thinks. In a surprising twist, a rival group within the criminal world, aware of Elena's rise to power, is preparing to take action. They've been watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as Williams Industries begins to fall into Elena's hands, a dark force is closing in on her. Richard's story may be over, but the legacy of the Williams brothers is far from finished. The final reckoning is yet to come. Elena may have won the battle, but the war is far from over. With Richard's conviction, Elena Vargas thought she had finally secured her future. The Williams brothers were out of the picture, and the company, the very foundation of their family empire, was hers for the taking. What she hadn't anticipated was the growing opposition from rival factions, each of them eager to take advantage of the power vacuum left by Thomas and Richard. Elena's rise had been carefully planned, a series of calculated moves that had led her to this moment. She was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a player in a much darker world. The criminal syndicates she had worked with in the shadows were growing bolder, and Elena had unwittingly become a target. But Elena wasn't one to back down easily. She had built her empire on manipulation, secrecy, and alliances forged in the underworld. She knew how to fight, how to survive. But as the months passed, she began to feel the pressure of being at the top of the heap. No one in the criminal world stays unscathed for long, and Elena's time of unchecked dominance was starting to unravel. The tension had been building for months, but it finally erupted when Elena received an unexpected message from an anonymous contact. The note was simple but ominous. "You're not the only one with plans for the company. You've made enemies. Watch your back." At first, Elena dismissed it as an empty threat, the kind of scare tactic often used by lesser criminals trying to stake their claim. But as the days went by, strange things began happening. Unexplained glitches in the company's security systems, anonymous people watching her from a distance, even members of her own inner circle acting suspiciously. It didn't take long for Elena to realize that her rise to power had made her more enemies than she had anticipated. The syndicates she had been involved with, while initially allies, were beginning to see her as a threat. They wanted Williams Industries, but not under Elena's control. To them, she was expendable, a pawn in a much larger game. The most terrifying part was the knowledge that the person behind these threats was someone she had once trusted, someone within the ranks of the very people she had worked with to take down the Williams brothers. Elena had been too confident in her position, too sure of her alliances. Now, it seemed, she had been played just as ruthlessly as Richard had. Meanwhile, in prison, Richard's life had taken a dark turn. The once powerful CEO was now just another inmate, stripped of everything he had once held dear. His wealth, his empire, and his reputation had all been shattered in a single moment of rage. Yet, despite his imprisonment, Richard's mind remained sharp. As the days stretched on, he began to realize that his downfall was not entirely his own doing. Thomas's betrayal, though tragic, had not been the root of the problem. No, the true mastermind behind everything was Elena Vargas. As the months passed, Richard's bitterness and anger festered. But there was something else, a growing determination to make things right. He knew that Elena's grip on the company was fragile, and he had a plan. Through connections in the criminal underworld, Richard began orchestrating a series of moves that would shake Elena's foundation to its core. He wasn't content to simply rot in prison. If he couldn't reclaim his empire, then at the very least, he would see Elena brought down. He started gathering information, making alliances, and subtly manipulating events in ways that only someone with his cunning could manage. Elena may have thought she had won, but Richard was ready to strike back from the shadows. Elena's sense of security was beginning to crack. Her once impenetrable empire was showing signs of weakness, and she could feel the walls closing in. As the threats escalated, she became more paranoid. She had already eliminated anyone she saw as a threat, but now it seemed that even her closest allies were turning on her. One fateful night, as Elena prepared for a high-stakes meeting with key members of the syndicate, she was alerted to a new development. The rival syndicate, which had been quietly working against her, had launched a coordinated attack against her operations. They had infiltrated her organization, undermined her alliances, and begun poaching key assets from Williams Industries. Elena had no choice but to face the truth. Her carefully built empire was crumbling, and the very syndicates she had worked with were now her greatest enemies. At the same time, Richard, with the help of his contacts, learned of the attack. He knew it was the perfect moment to strike. Elena, though powerful, was vulnerable now more than ever. Richard saw this as his final chance, not only for redemption, but for revenge. The inevitable showdown came when Richard managed to orchestrate a final move from his cell. Through a network of contacts, he sent an encrypted message to Elena, one that she couldn't ignore. "Your empire is slipping through your fingers, but there's still time to make a deal. I can give you what you need, everything you've been looking for, but you'll have to do things my way." Elena, ever the pragmatist, knew this was no idle threat. Richard had the leverage she needed to take back control of her empire. But would she be willing to play his game? As the two prepared for their final confrontation, one that would determine the fate of Williams Industries, the dark truth about their relationship and the forces pulling the strings in the background began to surface. Elena had played Thomas and Richard against each other, manipulating them both for her own benefit. But now, as her empire faced collapse, she was forced to confront the truth that Richard had always been the one in control. In the final moments of their meeting, as the tension reached its peak, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She could either accept Richard's terms, or she could fight back, hoping to reclaim the pieces of her shattered empire. The stakes have never been higher. As Richard and Elena face off in a battle for control, the future of the Williams legacy hangs in the balance. Will Elena's desperation lead to her downfall, or will Richard's thirst for revenge consume them both? The final twist is yet to come. Who will emerge victorious in this deadly game of power, betrayal, and ambition? As the months passed, Richard's life in prison became a twisted game of waiting, plotting, and surviving. The walls of his cell held nothing but his thoughts, and those thoughts were consumed with one singular purpose: revenge. He had no intention of quietly fading into obscurity. No, Richard had a plan, one that would tear apart everything Elena had worked for, and expose the ugly truth of how his brother's death was a mere piece of a much darker puzzle. Richard's network of contacts in the underworld had served him well. They provided him with the information he needed to remain one step ahead. Elena, who thought herself untouchable, had unwittingly walked into a trap. She had played the game of power, wealth, and manipulation, but she had underestimated Richard's hunger for retribution. The pieces were in motion, and it was only a matter of time before her empire collapsed. Elena had always thought she could control everything: her rivals, her business dealings, even the very people around her. But Richard's message had shaken her. She had been forced into a corner, and now she had no choice but to face the man she had betrayed. "You think you can control everything," Richard had said in his encrypted message, "but you were never the one pulling the strings. I always was. And now, you'll pay the price for thinking you could take everything from me." Elena Vargas was no stranger to danger, but she had always been in control, until now. As the pressure mounted, she began to feel the weight of her decisions closing in on her. The once confident woman who had carefully orchestrated the downfall of the Williams brothers now found herself questioning everything. She had played Richard for a fool, had used his brother's greed to manipulate him. But as her empire began to falter and the criminal syndicates she worked with turned their backs on her, Elena realized something she hadn't anticipated. She had no power left. Her allies were abandoning her. Her network was dissolving. She had nowhere to turn. The final blow came when one of her closest associates, a man named Victor Martinez, turned on her. Victor, who had once helped her eliminate potential threats, was now feeding information to Richard. He had realized that Elena's ambitions were too dangerous, and he wasn't willing to be dragged down with her. The tides had shifted, and Elena was no longer the puppet master. She was the puppet. The meeting was set in a dimly lit room, miles away from the eyes of the law, in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Richard had made his final move. With the information he had gathered, he had arranged for Elena to meet him in a place where her control would mean nothing. There would be no cameras, no allies, no place for her to hide. It was just the two of them, face to face with the truth. As Elena walked into the room, her eyes scanned the dark corners, looking for any sign of an ambush. But the only person in the room was Richard, quiet, composed, and dangerous. "I thought you were locked up for good," Elena sneered, her voice cold with contempt. Richard stood up slowly, his posture unwavering. "You thought wrong." The tension between them was palpable, an undercurrent of betrayal and resentment flowing through the air. Elena had never believed that Richard would be capable of taking such a direct approach, but now, with nowhere left to hide, she knew she had underestimated him. She had underestimated the depths of his rage, the lengths he would go to for revenge. "So what now?" Elena asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "You think you can take back everything? You think you can undo all that I've built?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "You've built nothing but lies. And now, it's time to pay for everything you've done." As Elena took a step forward, Richard's hand moved toward his pocket, pulling out a small flash drive. "Everything you've done is on here," he said, his voice sharp. "All the secrets, all the crimes you've committed. It's all yours to keep, if you can find a way out of this alive." The flash drive contained damning evidence. Evidence that would destroy Elena's empire and expose her as the mastermind behind not only Thomas's death, but the larger criminal operations she had been running. Richard's plan was simple. Either Elena would be taken down by her own actions, or she would try to silence him. In a final attempt to assert control, Elena lunged at Richard, her hands reaching for the flash drive. But Richard was faster. He stepped back, the cold metal of a gun now visible in his hand. "You're not in control anymore, Elena," Richard said, his voice steady and resolute. "You've lost." Elena's eyes widened as Richard held the gun, and the realization hit her like a freight train. She had been defeated, not by her enemies, not by the law, but by the very man she had betrayed. And in that moment, Elena knew there was no way out. She had gambled everything on her rise to power, and now she was about to lose it all. "I'm not like you," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you manipulate the world any longer. This ends tonight." With those words, Richard made his final decision. He had already suffered too much, lost too much to ever let Elena continue her reign of destruction. She had killed his brother, had destroyed his family, and now she would pay for it. The last thing Elena saw before the darkness took over was Richard's cold stare, unwavering, unforgiving. The final click of the gun, the sound of her own undoing. The next day, the news broke. Elena Vargas was found dead, her body discovered in the abandoned warehouse where she had met Richard. The authorities were quick to suspect foul play, but the evidence Richard had left behind was enough to put the final nail in Elena's coffin. She was exposed for all her crimes, and the syndicates she had been working with abandoned her, leaving her legacy in ruins. As for Richard, his actions came at a cost. Though he had taken down Elena and exposed her criminal empire, he knew there would be no coming back from this. The world would see him as just another killer, another criminal who had betrayed his own brother for a fortune. His redemption, if it ever existed, was now out of reach. Richard Williams had always believed in power, in control, but in the end, he learned that the price of ambition and betrayal was steep, and the consequences of one's actions could never truly be escaped. He had finally avenged his brother, but at what cost? Was it worth it to destroy everything he had once built, to lose the family he had left, to sacrifice his own soul for vengeance? As the story of Richard Williams and Elena Vargas concluded, one thing remained clear. In the pursuit of wealth, power, and revenge, no one escapes unscathed. The price of betrayal is high, and in the end, even the most powerful will fall. Thank you for following the tragic tale of Richard Williams, his brother Thomas, and the woman who brought them both down. This is a story of power, betrayal, and the destruction that follows when ambition overtakes one's humanity. We hope this case has left you thinking about the true cost of secrets and the consequences of a single, fatal decision. For more shocking true crime stories, make sure to subscribe to Dark True Crime Stories. And remember, sometimes the truth is darker than anything we can imagine.